Good to have you here. This is Unintended Consequences, episode 57, for July 13th, 2026. Monday, a fresh case to chew on as the week begins. 20th-century engineers built dams to power the West and control floods, then spent decades dismantling some so salmon could reach their spawning grounds again. In the fall of 2011, workers on Washington's Elwha River began the largest dam removal project in U.S. history. They started by cutting large openings through the concrete of the 108-foot-high Glines Canyon Dam, a structure that had stood in place since 1927 and whose reservoir had submerged miles of riverbed. The work was slow and methodical because crews had to manage the sudden release of decades of accumulated sediment without triggering uncontrolled downstream flooding. Within months, Chinook salmon that had been barred from 70 miles of upstream habitat began appearing again in the clear water above the old dam sites. Those fish were returning to gravel beds that had been inaccessible since the dams first blocked their migration routes. The structures had been erected to generate electricity and protect downstream farms. Their removal was now required to restore the very fish runs those farms and power plants had helped sustain for nearly a century. The logic had reversed because the original benefits, kilowatt hours delivered and flood peaks reduced, had been tallied in one set of ledgers while the costs to anadromous fish populations accumulated in another. Federal agencies and regional boosters in the 1930s saw untamed rivers as both threat and wasted resource. The Bureau of Reclamation, working under the New Deal, set out to build storage reservoirs that would irrigate arid land, generate cheap hydroelectricity, and reduce the devastating floods that had repeatedly inundated the Columbia and Klamath basins. Engineers calculated that holding back spring runoff in large reservoirs would let water be released steadily through turbines during peak demand periods, turning seasonal river flow into a reliable supply of power measured in megawatts. President Franklin Roosevelt personally championed Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia. He argued that public power would modernize rural economies and lift families out of poverty. At the time, salmon runs appeared inexhaustible. State and federal fisheries managers believed fish ladders or hatcheries could offset any losses from new barriers. The overriding calculation was straightforward. Stored water and falling water could be converted into measurable economic growth for a region still recovering from the Depression. Construction began on Bonneville Dam in 1933 and on Grand Coulee in 1933. Both were completed before the end of World War II. By 1942, Grand Coulee alone was producing more electricity than any other single installation in the United States and irrigating more than 500,000 acres of the Columbia Basin. Similar projects followed on the Klamath River. The Bureau of Reclamation completed Copco No. 1 in 1918 and later added J.C. Boyle, Copco No. 2, and Iron Gate. Early reports from the 1940s and 1950s documented rising farm output and falling flood damages. Local newspapers hailed the dams as permanent monuments to progress. A handful of fisheries biologists noted declining upstream passage. Their concerns were treated as secondary to national defense and agricultural expansion during and after the war. Once the dams were in place, anadromous fish lost access to the cold, gravel bed tributaries where they had historically spawned. On the Columbia system, estimates suggest that roughly 40% of historic salmon and steelhead habitat was blocked by the mid-1960s. Adult fish that reached the base of Grand Coulee or the Elwha dams either turned back or exhausted themselves attempting to surmount concrete faces never designed for passage. Juvenile outmigrants faced reservoirs that slowed their journey to the sea and increased predation. Over successive decades, commercial and tribal harvests on the lower rivers fell sharply. By the 1990s, several Columbia River stocks were listed under the Endangered Species Act. The causal chain ran through simple biology. Without access to natal streams, each generation produced fewer returning adults. This collapsed the nutrient cycle that had once carried marine-derived nitrogen into mountain forests. Tribal communities whose seasonal economies and ceremonial life had revolved around predictable salmon runs experienced cultural as well as economic loss that compounded across generations. By the late 1980s, mounting legal pressure from tribes and environmental groups, combined with the high cost of maintaining aging structures and operating fish hatcheries with limited success, shifted the policy conversation. Congress authorized removal of the two Elwha River dams in 1992. Deconstruction began in 2011 and was largely complete by 2014. On the Klamath, a 2016 agreement led to the drawdown of the four lower dams beginning in 2023. This became the largest river restoration project attempted in the United States. Early monitoring shows increased spawning activity above the former dam sites. Full recovery of historic run sizes will take decades and remains uncertain. The financial cost of removal, more than $300 million for the Elwha project alone, now appears on federal and state balance sheets that once recorded only construction and power revenues. Infrastructure decisions embed ecological debts that surface only after the original builders have left office and the surrounding economy has reorganized around the new river regime. When the full chain of effects, from blocked migration to lost nutrients to cultural disruption, finally becomes visible, reversal can require resources comparable to the original construction. The practical implication is that any large intervention should carry an explicit, funded mechanism for later reassessment, rather than assuming benefits will remain net positive indefinitely. The question for today's planners is which current systems, built with equally clear short-term gains, already contain similar long-term liabilities that will one day demand their own deliberate dismantling. We'll leave it there for today. Thanks for thinking through this one with me. If you know someone who loves a good cautionary tale, send it their way, and I'll see you tomorrow with another. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at Nerra Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the Nerra Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Fascinating Frontiers, the most fascinating news from space and science. Find every show free at nerranetwork.com. Want the written briefing with source links? Each show keeps a summaries page on nerranetwork.com. Scannable, dated, and free. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.